Welcome to this remarkable war survival chronicle, where forgotten civilian wisdom met the collapse of armies and nations. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and the exact time this story found you. These quiet war stories often travel farther than battles ever did. In the brutal winter of 1946, when victory celebrations had long ended but survival struggles had only begun, a discovery would emerge that challenges everything we understand about civilian endurance during infrastructure collapse. The war was over. Supply lines designed for military logistics had vanished overnight. Rural communities across America found themselves more isolated than they had been during the darkest years of rationing. But one woman's response to this isolation would develop techniques so sophisticated that modern survival experts still study them today. Her name was Evangeline Blackwater, and her story begins not with triumph, but with the mathematical certainty that winter would test every assumption about what it takes to stay alive when civilization temporarily fails. Evangeline Blackwater was 31 years old when the Western Union telegram arrived at her isolated farmstead near Salmon, Idaho, in late August 1945. The message was brief and devastating. Her husband, Technical Sergeant Michael Blackwater, had been lost during the final operations in the Pacific Theater. No body had been recovered. No pension would arrive for at least 8 months. No family lived within 300 miles. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away through mountain roads that became completely impassable when winter snow accumulated beyond 4 feet. The nearest town, Salmon, was 18 miles distant by routes that would close entirely from December through March. What Evangeline possessed was 2 1/2 cords of seasoned pine logs, 63 pounds of white flour, 12 gallons of kerosene, 47 pounds of preserved salt pork, 28 pounds of dried beans, 16 pounds of cornmeal, and the absolute certainty that she would need to survive 137 days of complete isolation. The local supply depot had closed permanently on September 15th. Railroad service to the mountain communities would suspend operations until spring. Mail delivery had already ended. Emergency services were non-existent beyond what neighbors could provide to each other. And even neighbors would become unreachable once the high country filled with snow. The federal government had demobilized rural support infrastructure with the same efficiency it had mobilized for wartime production. Roads maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers reverted to county responsibility, but counties lacked resources for winter maintenance. Medical services guaranteed to military families simply ended when discharge papers were signed. Evangeline understood immediately that her survival depended not on the quantity of resources she possessed, but on the efficiency with which she could utilize them. She had exactly 9 weeks to prepare for complete isolation. During this period, she would need to develop systems that could sustain one person through the longest, coldest winter on record, using only materials available on her property or within walking distance of her farmstead. What happened next would establish principles of civilian survival that remain relevant today, but in September 1945, she was simply trying to avoid becoming another casualty of the transition from wartime to peacetime logistics. Her approach contradicted every conventional wisdom about winter preparation. Instead of stockpiling additional food, she began calculating precise caloric requirements for minimum survival. Instead of gathering more firewood, she designed thermal management systems that would maximize heat retention while minimizing fuel consumption. Instead of attempting to preserve the farmhouse's existing heating systems, she began constructing what amounted to a human hibernation facility in the basement. Her strategy was based on a fundamental insight that would later influence military survival training. Survival depends not on abundance, but on efficiency. The farmhouse basement measured 14 feet by 18 feet. Evangeline divided this space into 4 distinct zones. a sleeping area measuring 5 feet by 8 feet, a food preparation area measuring 4 feet by 5 feet, a storage area for supplies, and a workshop area for equipment maintenance. Every surface in the sleeping area was lined with salvaged wool blankets taken from the main house, then covered with waterproof canvas to prevent moisture accumulation. The sleeping space itself was raised 24 inches from the basement floor using wooden crates and sawhorses, creating an insulation buffer that would prove critical when ground temperatures dropped below the safe threshold. She constructed a sophisticated heat distribution system using salvaged materials from the farmstead's workshop. The centerpiece was a modified wood-burning stove created from a 50-gallon steel drum with carefully calculated air intake holes and a heat exchanger built from smaller metal containers. This system could burn precisely measured quantities of wood while capturing and redistributing heat that would normally escape through the chimney. A network of metal pipes and reflective surfaces directed warm air throughout the basement space, creating temperature zones that could be adjusted based on fuel availability and outside conditions. But the most ingenious element of her system was the thermal scheduling protocol. Rather than maintaining constant heat, which would exhaust her wood supply within 6 weeks, she calculated that she could maintain survival temperatures by implementing 3 heating cycles per day: a morning cycle lasting 32 minutes, a midday cycle lasting 28 minutes, and an evening cycle lasting 35 minutes. Each cycle burned exactly 18 ounces of seasoned pine. The thermal mass of the basement walls and floor would retain sufficient heat to prevent dangerous cold between heating cycles, provided she remained in the insulated sleeping area during non-heating periods. Her food rationing system was equally precise. The 63 pounds of flour would provide approximately 98,000 calories. The salt pork would contribute an additional 37,000 calories. The beans and cornmeal would add 28,000 calories. Total available calories, approximately 163,000. Divided across 137 days, this provided 1,190 calories per day, significantly below normal requirements, but sufficient to prevent hunger if combined with minimal physical activity and maximum thermal efficiency. She would eat exactly 3 meals per day: morning meal consisting of 2 ounces of cornmeal cooked in water, midday meal consisting of 1 ounce of salt pork and 2 ounces of flour prepared as hardtack, and evening meal consisting of 1 ounce of dried beans and 2 ounces of flour. By October 23rd, when the first significant snowfall arrived, Evangeline had also addressed water procurement, waste management, ventilation, and emergency protocols. She had identified 3 separate water sources within her basement facility: melted snow collected through a roof drainage system, groundwater accessible through a hand-pumped well in the basement's northeast corner, and emergency water stored in sealed containers. Waste disposal would utilize a composting system constructed in the basement's furthest corner, with ventilation provided through existing foundation openings that could be opened or closed based on temperature requirements. The first major test of her systems came earlier than anticipated. By November 8th, snow accumulation had reached 5 feet. By November 20th, 7 feet. Interior temperatures in the main farmhouse dropped below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Evangeline moved permanently into her basement survival facility. She would not emerge for 19 consecutive weeks. Her daily routine became a precisely choreographed sequence of survival tasks. She woke each morning at exactly sunrise, determined by the faint light filtering through the basement's single window. First heating cycle: 18 ounces of pine, burned according to carefully calculated airflow patterns, extinguished after 32 minutes. Morning meal: 2 ounces of cornmeal mixed with snow melt water, cooked on residual heat from the stove. Physical exercise: 12 minutes of movement designed to maintain circulation without excessive caloric expenditure. Then rest, wrapped in multiple layers of wool blankets, until the midday heating cycle. The pattern never varied. Midday heating cycle at exactly 12:15. Lunch, 1 ounce of salt pork and 2 ounces of flour. Afternoon rest period. Evening heating cycle at 6:45. Dinner, beans and flour. Sleep from 8:15 until sunrise. 7 days per week, 19 weeks. No deviation, no waste. No emergency burns that might compromise the fuel allocation calculations. Her discipline was absolute because her calculations left no margin for error. A single day of excessive fuel consumption could mean extreme cold later in the winter. A single day of excessive food consumption could mean hunger before spring. But what happened on February 4th would test every aspect of her survival systems. A military supply convoy attempting to reach isolated communities became stranded approximately 3/4 of a mile from her property. 4 soldiers, suffering from severe cold exposure and frostbite, somehow located her farmstead. Finding the main house dark and apparently unoccupied, they began breaking up interior furniture for emergency firewood. The smoke from their improvised fire reached Evangeline's basement hideout through the ventilation system she had constructed. She faced an impossible moral dilemma. Her system could sustain 1 person for 137 days. It could sustain 5 people for perhaps 34 days. Not nearly enough time to reach spring thaw. Sharing her food would mean hunger for everyone. Sharing her fuel would mean cold for everyone. But allowing 4 soldiers to face the elements when she possessed the knowledge and infrastructure to help them violated every principle she understood about human responsibility during crisis situations. What she did next would not be discovered until 24 years later in documents that almost no one was specifically searching for. Evangeline emerged from the basement and revealed her survival systems to the soldiers. But instead of simply sharing her existing resources, she taught them to construct a parallel survival facility in the farmhouse's root cellar. Using her thermal management principles and construction techniques, they built a 4-person version of her heat retention system. The soldiers contributed their military emergency rations, enough food for 8 weeks, when combined with her remaining supplies and carefully rationed according to her caloric calculations. More importantly, they contributed additional labor for gathering supplemental firewood from fallen trees covered under snow throughout the surrounding forested areas. The combined group survived until the spring thaw arrived in early April. All 5 individuals emerged in acceptable physical condition. The soldiers were evacuated by military transport on April 18th. Evangeline remained on the property until late June, when she sold the farmstead and relocated to Sacramento, California. She never spoke publicly about the winter of 1946. The soldiers filed standard military survival reports that mentioned civilian assistance, but provided no technical details about the thermal management techniques or resource allocation systems they had learned. Their reports focused on standard survival procedures and made no mention of the sophisticated engineering solutions that had made their survival possible. The story might have remained completely unknown except for a routine archive review conducted by the Idaho State Historical Society in 1969. A research assistant named Vincent Cartwright was cataloging property tax records when he discovered a significant discrepancy. Utility disconnection records for the Blackwater farmstead showed 0 heating fuel consumption between October 1945 and April 1946, despite property tax records indicating continuous occupation throughout the period. The discrepancy was subtle but important. Postal Service logs showed mail delivery attempts through November. County snow removal records indicated that access roads remained completely impassable from December through March, but utility company records showed no heating oil, propane, or coal deliveries during the coldest winter in regional history. Cartwright was a methodical researcher who had developed expertise in identifying documentation gaps that might indicate unreported historical events. The Blackwater property discrepancy suggested either massive record-keeping errors or survival techniques that operated completely outside normal infrastructure systems. This particular anomaly suggested that someone had survived an entire winter using resources and methods that left no trace in official utility or supply records. Cartwright began investigating systematically. His research uncovered military transport logs showing emergency evacuation of 4 soldiers from the Blackwater property in April 1946. Agricultural extension records showed that no food deliveries were made to the property during the winter isolation period. Weather Service records confirmed that the winter of 1945-1946 had been the most severe in 50 years, with temperatures dropping as low as -42 degrees Fahrenheit and snow accumulations reaching unprecedented levels. The mathematical impossibility of these combined facts led Cartwright to search for additional documentation that might explain how anyone could have survived such conditions without leaving traces in official supply records. In the basement storage areas of the Salmon County Courthouse, he discovered a collection of miscellaneous documents that included Evangeline's detailed survival journal, written in pencil on pages torn from ledger books and account notebooks. The journal contained precise records of fuel consumption, food rationing, thermal measurements, and daily survival tasks for every single day between October 23rd and April 15th. The entries were remarkable for their technical precision and emotional restraint. Each day's entry recorded exact quantities of fuel burned, food consumed, water procured, and maintenance tasks completed. The final entry, dated April 14th, consisted of a single sentence. 5 people learned to live on resources calculated for 1 person because knowledge multiplies what materials alone cannot provide. Cartwright also located 2 of the surviving soldiers from the incident. Staff Sergeant Douglas Pemberton was living in Denver, Colorado. Corporal James Hensley had settled in Portland, Oregon. Both men confirmed every detail recorded in Evangeline's journal and provided additional information about the engineering techniques she had developed and taught them during their shared survival experience. According to both soldiers, her thermal management system was significantly more sophisticated than any cold weather survival training they had received during their military service. She understood heat as a resource that could be managed like ammunition or fuel, Pemberton told Cartwright in a recorded interview conducted in 1970. The military teaches you to survive cold weather. She taught us to engineer warmth from almost nothing. Hensley provided additional details about the resource allocation systems that had made group survival possible. She showed us that survival isn't about having enough of what you need, he explained. It's about needing less of what you have. Everything she did was designed to reduce requirements rather than increase supplies. That's not how the Army approaches survival problems, but it's what kept us alive when Army methods would have failed. Both soldiers emphasized that Evangeline's approach had required not just technical knowledge, but extraordinary discipline. You couldn't cheat on her system, Pemberton recalled. If you burned too much fuel one day, you faced cold later. If you ate too much food one day, you faced hunger later. She taught us that survival discipline isn't about being tough, it's about being precise. The implications of Evangeline's methods extended far beyond individual winter survival. Her approach demonstrated that civilian populations could maintain subsistence-level existence even after complete infrastructure collapse, provided they understood thermal engineering principles and possessed the discipline to implement strict resource management protocols. These lessons became particularly relevant during the Cold War period when civil defense planners were developing survival strategies for nuclear attack scenarios that might involve extended periods of infrastructure failure and resource scarcity. Vincent Cartwright completed his research in 1971 and submitted a comprehensive report to the Idaho State Historical Society titled Advanced Civilian Survival Techniques in Post-War Rural Communities, the Blackwater Case Study, and its implications for emergency preparedness. The report documented not only Evangeline's survival methods, but also analyzed their potential applications to modern emergency preparedness and disaster relief planning. The report was filed in the Society's archives and largely forgotten by academic researchers. Cartwright passed away in 1973. The surviving soldiers from the incident had all passed away by 1982. Evangeline herself passed away in Sacramento in 1977, leaving no direct descendants and no record that she had ever discussed the events of that winter with anyone except the military investigators who interviewed her in 1946. What remains from that winter is a lesson about human adaptability that transcends the specific circumstances of post-war survival challenges. Evangeline Blackwater understood that survival depends not on accumulating resources, but on using available resources with mathematical precision and absolute efficiency. She proved that knowledge, specifically knowledge about thermodynamics, caloric mathematics, and resource optimization, could overcome material scarcity that would otherwise prove fatal to unprepared individuals. Most importantly, she demonstrated that individual survival techniques could be scaled to group survival without abandoning the principles that made survival possible. Her story challenges contemporary assumptions about disaster preparedness, which typically focus on stockpiling supplies rather than developing systems for resource optimization and efficiency maximization. It suggests that the difference between survival and failure often lies not in what you have stored away, but in how efficiently you can utilize what remains when storage runs out and resupply becomes impossible. And it reminds us that the most crucial survival skill may be the ability to share life-saving knowledge even when sharing material resources would compromise everyone's survival prospects. Today, as climate change increases the frequency of infrastructure failures and supply chain disruptions, Evangeline's methods offer insights that extend far beyond winter survival applications. Her thermal management principles apply to any situation where energy resources become scarce. Her rationing mathematics apply to any scenario requiring long-term resource allocation under scarcity conditions. Her engineering approaches apply to any circumstance demanding improvised solutions constructed from available materials. Modern disaster preparedness experts have studied her techniques and adapted them for contemporary emergency protocols and training curricula. The Federal Emergency Management Agency now includes thermal efficiency calculations in cold weather survival guidelines that closely mirror Evangeline's heating cycle methodologies. Urban survival specialists teach workshops on improvised heating systems based on her modified drum stove designs. Military survival schools have incorporated her resource scheduling and allocation techniques into advanced training programs. The principles she developed during that desperate winter have become foundational knowledge for anyone preparing to survive infrastructure collapse, whether caused by natural disasters, economic disruption, or security emergencies. But perhaps the most important lesson from that winter is moral rather than technical. When faced with the choice between individual survival and collective survival, Evangeline chose neither approach. Instead, she chose the much more difficult path of sharing knowledge while maintaining resource discipline, teaching others to build their own survival systems rather than simply giving away her carefully calculated supplies. This approach enabled 5 people to survive instead of putting everyone at risk through inadequate resource sharing. It preserved the principles that made survival possible while extending those principles to benefit others who had not had the opportunity to develop them independently. The documents from that winter, now housed in the Idaho State Historical Society archives, tell a story that would be almost impossible to believe if it were not documented with such methodical precision and corroborated by multiple independent sources. They describe temperatures that remained below -30 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time, snow accumulations that reached 9 feet, and periods of complete isolation that lasted nearly 5 months. They also describe 5 people who survived conditions that should have proved fatal, using techniques developed by a woman who understood that winter is not an enemy to be fought with brute force, but a mathematical problem to be solved with precision engineering. What Evangeline Blackwater understood about cold was this: it is not the cold itself that causes survival failure, it is the waste. Waste of heat through inadequate insulation, waste of calories through inefficient rationing, waste of motion through unnecessary activity, waste of resources through imprecise allocation, waste of knowledge through failure to share life-saving techniques. Winter is unforgiving not because it is intentionally cruel, but because it is absolutely efficient. It eliminates anything that does not directly contribute to survival. The only way to survive winter successfully is to become equally efficient in every aspect of resource utilization and energy management. This fundamental principle applies beyond winter survival to every crisis situation where abundance becomes scarcity, where comfort becomes struggle, where normal infrastructure meets catastrophic failure. The mathematics of survival remain constant across all circumstances. Efficiency determines outcome more than initial resources. Knowledge multiplies available materials more effectively than stockpiling, and disciplined execution extends endurance beyond what seems physically possible based on simple resource calculations. This is what we forgot when central heating and reliable supply chains made winter survival automatic rather than intentional. We forgot that survival is a skill requiring constant practice, not a circumstance requiring only adequate preparation. We forgot that knowledge can substitute for resources when resources become unavailable. But resources cannot substitute for knowledge when knowledge is absent. We forgot that individual survival and collective survival are not mutually exclusive if you understand the engineering systems and resource management principles that make both possible simultaneously. We forgot that efficiency, not abundance, determines who survives when systems collapse and supply chains fail completely during extended crisis periods. We forgot that the difference between catastrophe and endurance often lies in understanding how much you actually need versus how much you think you need for adequate preparation. We forgot that winter teaches lessons about resource allocation, energy management, and survival discipline that apply to every aspect of human survival, in every season, under every circumstance, where scarcity threatens life itself and challenges our most basic assumptions about modern preparedness strategies and infrastructure reliability during emergency situations that test the limits of individual and collective resilience.